kind of in a mood tonight, Josh, so it might get a little weird.
It's all good with me because this is Life in Cyber. Let's do it.
Let's go. I felt that I got baited on that.
Speaking of bait, I've been playing Final Fantasy VII and that game is actually really good. I've been having fun hanging out with like the gym bros. Like in Remake, you get to do like pull-ups and squats, and now it's sit-ups. And for some reason, these mini games are so good.
You'd rather do that than go to the gym and do them for real.
Yeah, I'm never going to actually do that. I got to do it in a game where I get haptic feedback on the triggers. It makes my fingers feel nice.
Ooh, buzz again. All right. What are we talking about today, fellas?
Linux.
Sorry, what was that?
Linux.
Oh. That's probably why Shannon's not with us today. Is he heard Linux and went running?
Yeah, but once we said Linux, you busted out your Tim Allen impression pretty much immediately. I feel bad for your wife if that's what you sound like when you get excited.
Yahoo!
No, I got is. That's the most I got.
I miss Wilson. All right, moving on. Anyway, yeah, let's talk about Linux today. I am the Linux guru in my neck of the woods as well. So, talk a little bit about how Linux is actually starting to make a comeback. And even people like Tech Target and a lot of the news agencies are starting to talk more and more about it. And what do you think that is? Let's start there.
Well, I'm going to ask a very, what's the word? I'm going to ask a very pointed question.
Ooh.
Is it the year of Linux? Is it the year of the Linux desktop?
I don't know if it's desktop, but I think it's going to take over a lot of back end, a lot of server. I know a lot of our developers are starting to use it more and more. A lot of it's cost reasons. But I think it's also getting less scary. I think there's definitely a side of us, especially in IT, where like Linux, we're like, it's free. And that's kind of where we end. But I think once you really get into it, you realize it's not that bad. And it's actually a lot easier in many ways to administer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big thing that a lot of people are looking at is the back end we were always looking at with Microsoft is licensing, that topic that we all hate to talk about. But Microsoft's been shooting themselves in the foot by making it harder and more expensive on all of us. So a lot of us are having smaller budgets. So they're like, hey, how do we save money? And we have to come up with those methodologies, right? And so as cyber analysts and system administrators and engineers and all of the above, we all are looking for, well, is there a freebie solution, right? And in comes Linux.
I love Linux management, by the way. I just went through I'm gonna call it a crash course on Ansible, which, by the way, is top tier management tool. There's a lot of things in it that I still don't yet understand. I'm at the beginner level of Ansible, but holy cow, is that powerful! And when you look at the world of and I'm going to say some of the conversations we've had before, so I'm going to repeat some of this. If you look at the world of Windows and the world of ads and the world of telemetry, Linux ain't got that. I mean, it could, but you could always just turn it off.
Yeah. And I hate to use the word telemetry because I mix that with open telemetry, and open telemetry is something that we all like in cybersecurity, right?
Yeah.
We want to know what people are typing and using on our computers or installing for that point, right? Because sometimes we have those developers out there that need admin access. Well, we don't want to just give them free reign and then not watch them, right? So open telemetry is one of those things with Linux that makes it so much easier to track versus Windows. Because I remember, I hate that Shannon's not here. Shannon was bugging us weeks ago about, hey, I want to track every time PowerShell is used and the commands that are typed in PowerShell and all this stuff. And it wasn't easy in Windows. But in Linux, it's almost built in. You just turn it on.
Well, let's do a quick overall market understanding. What are the big four operating systems out there? We all know Windows, Mac, Linux. So what else is out there?
The big four is Windows, Mac, as we already know. Those are the two big ones. We got Chrome OS and Linux. Those are the other two big ones. So Chrome OS actually had a bigger market share than Linux does, mostly when it came to desktops, right? Because there's just a lot more devices when it comes to desktops than there are servers. But as of this year, everyone's talking that, hey, we've actually grown in desktop usage by 1.58% globally, which is huge. We're talking 4% usage of Linux as a desktop, and it's never happened before.
The craziest part of that stat to me is that it gained 30% of that just in June to January of last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the fastest Linux desktop growth that's ever been recorded.
And there's been a lot of advancements in Linux distributions. Linux itself is so stable. That's why a lot of us use it for servers, right? It's one of those things that I could set up as a server and almost forget about it. Now, in cybersecurity, we always think about, hey, we should patch our stuff, make sure it's up to date, stuff like that. But other than that, I'd love to have a server that's just robust, right? Something that's going to run. I'm not going to get woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning because it froze or blue screened or whatever it may be. And Linux has always been that tried and true. Now, when it comes to desktops, it's always been a little bit harder to use because Linux has always got that stigma of, hey, it's all CLI. There's not very much GUI in front where user interaction was really hard. And no longer is that the case.
Yeah, it was always kind of ugly back in the day. It always reminded you of like 2 versions ago of Windows, where you're like, oh, this is like 98 or this is like 2000. This GUI's so old and gross. But yeah, I'll also second the whole server backend things. Sadly, I'll admit, but at the same time, I think it shows the power of Linux. I've had servers that ran for 2-3 years, and I checked on it, and I'm like, wow, I haven't rebooted this in over 2 years. That's insane. I couldn't imagine doing that on a Windows box.
I forgot I even had this box.
Yeah, it's almost to that point where you're like, huh, when's the last time I restarted my NTP server or my FTP server? And
Right.
usually you're going back in and you're like, oh, okay, it's been a while.
Uptime 934 days. You're like,
Yeah.
wow, pretty good.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, at the same time, that looks bad for a patching point of view.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, it does show its stability, because the big thing about Windows servers that I've always hated is the world of buffer overflow and memory leaks. I'm sorry, Windows software is just not meant to run forever. It needs a kick in the teeth, right? And I always tell people, hey, have you kicked the server this month? Anytime I had a Windows box, I always made sure once a month I kicked it, mainly because I'm like, hey, you're patching it anyway, let's reboot it, right? But with Linux, I can patch it live. I don't even have to reboot it, right?
You just restart a service. It's much easier.
Exactly.
So much easier.
So I think the biggest thing that I've been noticing on the Linux side, there's a new OS that came out called Zorin. I don't know if you guys have heard about it. It's Zorin. It's a Ubuntu clone. So for anyone who doesn't know, Linux does have a few different kernel levels. One's Ubuntu and one's normally Red Hat. Those are the two biggest ones. There are some other ones like BSD and some of the Oracle-owned software I won't mention. But Zorin OS came out, and it's an awesome desktop. It's actually the best desktop OS that if I would install it for my grandma. That's how easy it is to use. It's very Windows-esque, and we really don't have to do much with it. And it also comes with pre-installed and pre-configured Wine9, which for anyone who doesn't know, Wine allows us to run Windows applications. And Wine9 has been the best thing ever. Like, I was playing Overwatch the other night on Zorin OS, and I didn't have to do anything. I just installed Steam. I installed Blizzard, and Blizzard's like, hey, this only runs on Windows. And I'm like, yeah, I'm Windows not. And I installed it anyway. And guess what? It ran just fine.
I always say
Zorin.
that Linux desktop adoption comes down to 2 things. One is convincing users that something else is out there, right? And there are a lot that are very resistant to change just because they don't want to learn something else, even if it's similar. But on the other side of it, it's also the management tools, right? On the back end. I always say that, like, for businesses, which is, I would say, a large majority of Microsoft's income, the only reason they do Microsoft as their OS is because of Active Directory and all of the management tools that comes with that suite, right? Active Directory is incredibly powerful, and everything that is bundled with it, group policy, etc.
Right.
It's really difficult to compete with that. But then I learned Ansible, and I'm like, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm. Linux has its
However,
own tools, right?
Microsoft is also, kind of going a step further than that with Intra, Azure AD, Intune, etc. So they're doing like cloud management tools. Linux, you kind of got to hodgepodge a bunch of things together. It can still be done, and I think it's just a lack of education, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think the lack of education of knowing what's out there, because it wasn't even that long ago. If I wanted to join my Red Hat or my Ubuntu box to an Active Directory domain, there was a lot of hoops you had to jump through, right? And it was daunting, to say the least, for most system administrators. But as of 8.9 on on the Red Hat side, and 22 and higher on Ubuntu side, Realm join my domain, and I hit enter. I type my username and password. It goes, okay, I'm joined. I'm like, that's how hard it is. Just as hard as joining a Windows box now.
Yeah, all I've got to do is a little SSSD config, and even then, you just have one config file that works, and you just copy it over to everything afterwards. Like, so much easier than the days of like light DM on Ubuntu. Oh God,
Right. It
and
still
that used to
uses
break with NVIDIA drivers for no reason.
right. It still uses a lot of those tools in the back end. It's just so much easier to configure now. Right. And then, like you were saying, like Ansible itself, Ansible is a wonderful automation tool. I love it because not only is it a configuration tool for Linux environments, it's also a sanity check to make sure that nothing has changed since the last time I've looked at that box. I can run it just as a run only script and be like, yep, my NTP servers are right, my Resolve DNS servers are right, everything's right. And then if I need to change the DNS servers on 1,000 boxes, I change one playbook and run it. Yep. Like it, I can change it all within 15 minutes versus touching every box individually. So now Windows had the same functionality, right? We've talked about that. Like group policy was its like claim to fame, right? Group policy allowed us to remotely manage all of our Windows joined boxes. But what's cool about Ansible, you don't have to be joined to the domain. It don't have to be, single federated services if you don't want to. But anyway, that's a huge soapbox. I could talk like a whole podcast on Linux management, but it's just gotten so much better over the last few years. And guess what? I don't have to pay for it. ATX is free.
And it's clientless Ansible.
Yes.
Now there are paid versions of Ansible, and I think ultimately it's owned by IBM, I think.
Yeah, Red Hat and IBM, I think it's a joint partnership now. Because OpenShift and OpenShift is mostly built on Ansible now.
And it's interesting to see. I like, when we were younger, I never thought I'd see the day of, somebody monetizing Linux and Linux components, but it was bound to happen. And that's why you're starting to see like CentOS die off last year, but Rocky Linux coming in as a really strong start, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of shift and change happening in the Linux sphere right now, but that open source mentality is still very much a strong thing happening in the world. A lot of people are looking for ways to monetize their software. And I think the ultimate, like the old philosophy was that software should be free. That philosophy, I think, is long dead. They're just finding different ways to monetize, right?
Right. Just because it's open source in Linux, and a lot of corporate environments is worried about that kind of stuff, right? If you're in a corporate environment, you're like, I want to put Windows or Linux in as desktops. They're like, well, what happens when I have problems? You're like, you can still buy support for these operating systems, just like you do with Microsoft. And to be honest, the support that I get out of the Linux companies, so much more responsive than Microsoft. Microsoft, I'd be lucky if I get a 72-hour response sometimes as a gold member, But with Linux, it was like I put in a ticket and they're like, oh, you paid for support? My phone's already ringing, within 30 minutes. So I don't know. I view that there's a stigma on Linux and it needs to change. And I think we're starting to see that change.
Where does that stigma begin, do you think? Is it because like Linux historically had always been more difficult or less compatible? Because I remember the days of like having to do all of these special configs just to get it to connect to the wireless. Now it's gotten easier, but I think a lot of people just aren't willing to give it that chance. Is that a fair assessment, or is there more to it?
I think that's a very fair assessment that Linux just took a bit to get its sea legs. All right. It used to be the nerd operating system that we all had to, you had to have an MIT degree in order to use, but you don't have to do that anymore, right? It's actually meant for the common folk. I don't want to say it that way, but it really is. It's like, hey, do you have an Android phone? Guess what? It runs a virgin. It runs a virgin, just in case you wanted to know, a version of Linux. So what's Mac OS? It's Linux. There's a lot of things out there that people are using today, and they don't even realize they're using Linux. And so,
yeah, I think it also goes back to the CLI thing. I know even from my experience in past jobs, I remember when Microsoft started going big on PowerShell. And I'd have like some old school system admins like, oh, I got to PowerShell that anymore. Now I don't want to do that. I want to click a few buttons and just move forward. And it's like, I was like, I get what they're doing though. Like, we're trying to get cloud ready here. We're trying to get automation ready. We can't do that through a bunch of pointing and clicking. There is software that helps with that, but it's not scalable.
It really is. It's the difference between old school system administrators who are just task oriented, right? Focused on getting the job done versus focusing on automating that job so you can do something else, right? It's a completely different change in philosophy. And I think that philosophy shift started happening about, I would say 8 to 10 years ago, where suddenly the sysadmin mentality shifted from, can I get this done, to, if I have to do it once, I'm going to script it, right? And that really didn't, in Windows, that really wasn't very viable until PowerShell came out, because you could do a lot of like batch scripting and it was okay. You could do some Visual Basic and it was okay, but it really wasn't like designed for it. You were almost like band-aiding on top of the OS for things that it wasn't ready for. Whereas PowerShell, it's like integrated 100% now, which is a huge, huge difference, and definitely a big boost toward, Windows staying in the market. If Microsoft didn't make that shift, Linux would be surpassing them in the business, no problem, probably by now. But thank goodness they had the foresight, I guess. But
well, how many of you actually have your Unix commands turned on in Windows? I do.
The Windows subsystem for Linux, right?
I have to have them on, because if I open up command prompt and I type ls and command line tells me one more time that it doesn't understand what ls is, I'm gonna just like, okay, I guess I'm not using Windows today.
I'm the same way. I do a lot of CLI Linux, and I often forget, because I've got a heavily mixed environment that I do. So sometimes I'm bouncing between CentOS DB and Fedora, but also a little bit of Red Hat, and then also a little bit of Windows, and it's all over the dang place. And I can never remember if it's dir or ls, and I don't like dir. It's too many keys and they're not close enough together. LS is just faster and easier to type. And so I don't know. I'm with you on that. However, the part that I'm still shocked at is that you can literally emulate an entire Ubuntu OS without running a virtual machine. That blows my mind.
It kind of tells me how much is Windows now getting closer and closer to Linux themselves. There's more and more underneath the hood that's getting closer and closer. We're converging, right?
On that note, question for you. You said Mac OS is Linux. Mac OS is based off of BSD. Does BSD count as Linux?
I still count it as Linux. Okay, Unix. Okay, guys. I'm sorry. But we'll put an L on it from Linus. Linus just really likes it.
Took a slightly different turn.
But really, if you get so used to, like, if let's say you run a Ubuntu box as your main box, which I do most of the day, I love just running a Linux box as my main box. Now, when I game, I still use a Windows box. I'm still out there. I'm not a 100% Linux guy, mainly just due to the fact that some of the newer like game drivers and stuff like that, just they are not keeping up with it. If you were a developer, you're going to develop towards the mass, right? So if 80% of the people were using one thing, that's the first thing you're going to develop towards, right? Linux just doesn't have as many users yet. But with that said, with OpenGL and all this other things that even like NVIDIA has been working on, they're now cross-platform. I can put that same driver on my Windows box as my Linux box, and it has changed the world dramatically. Something that you were talking about earlier is like, thank you, Broadcom. We're going to make fun of Broadcom for a second.
I love railing Broadcom every episode now.
Broadcom deserves it, okay? What they're doing to VMware is an injustice, and we all should stand up for it. All right. Anyway, but Broadcom themselves that was the biggest heartache when you went to Linux back in the day. You're like, I installed it on this old laptop. My wireless card don't work. Because guess what? Most of the wireless cards back out in the day, even still today, are Broadcom, right? Realtek and Broadcom is like, if I don't have those two drivers, why should I use Linux? But now that they are coming out with open source drivers themselves, okay, let me give them a kudos. Thank you, Broadcom. That now that there's actual Broadcom drivers out there, the transition has never been easier.
Now, I have to say, like, as a leader in the IT business, I have to be very particular if I select an open source solution for something that's going on in my business, right? And for one reason is you never know when support is going to end for that product, because a lot of the time open source is done by a small community of people or one or two developers or something like that, and then it just gets picked up because it's a good program and they did a good job. But then when it explodes and gets popular, they can't do it and they just drop support, right? How many times have we seen that happen? It happens in open source almost every day, it seems. And so how do I get to a point where I can like rely as a business leader on an open source product and know that it's going to get security patching, know that it's going to be okay to use in the future for at least 5 years, as far as like a software application? Like if I'm going to design entire business practices around this product, I need to know that it's going to be around for a while. How do I do that?
Josh, I know you've done this many times where you're currently working. You've actually talked about budget constraints and things that we're all feeling. It's nothing new for the industry. How do you guys handle that? Because I know you guys are trying to use more Linux as a background tool, right?
Yeah, I think you definitely have to pick your battles there. We still use Windows a lot where it makes sense. But we're also going more cloud. So a lot of those things we're picking SaaS platforms, and that becomes no longer our problem. But internally, we still have, Windows servers for a lot of our file servers because permissioning is just easier. It's a lot more understandable by our team. However, when it comes to like small little services, like I mentioned earlier, like an NTP service or an FTP service, something that you just want running that doesn't really need much change or isn't much different OS to OS, that's usually where we'll throw that in. Like we have some file shares that are open to everyone on our staff; those are Linux based. We have, I know I've talked about Proxmox before. Like that's kind of what we used to have like our DMZ for. Like it's all Proxmox, nice and easy, clean stuff. But yeah, I think we have to pick our battles. It can be very difficult to pick certain things, and I've definitely gone down some of those rabbit holes in the past, especially back in our college days, trying out different things. I remember playing with Helix, an old Linux like forensics toolkit, and all these other things, and then I go back,
Helix.
yeah, and I go back to things like that today, like Kenny says, and you go back, I'm like, where'd this go? This was great. And then they just kind of gave up on it, or it got replaced by something else.
Or got bought out.
It got bought out. Yeah, companies get bought out, like Red Hat buying out CentOS because they wanted to get rid of it. But then you have some others that come in, like Rocky Linux, and it's like, nope, we're not doing this again. It's tough. I know we have a bunch of CentOS boxes that we're switching over to Rocky Linux now because we can see where that's going. But that's the great thing about Linux too, though, that there's so many branches and they're all based off of basically 3. And so they'll always be similar. They'll always have very similar backends, and you can shift to that. But yeah, you do have to be careful not to pick something that's like a weird one-off.
Yeah, and I think that's I think you guys both kind of hit it on the head, right? Is this a community-driven project or not? Or is there really some major funding behind it, like Rocky? Right, where they have, hey, here's our next 10-year roadmap for this operating system. Okay, I can stand behind that, right? And I think that's something I've always looked at. But that's the other thing is people really talk about my soapboxes. I'll try to do something, and I've had other people tell me, no, you can't switch it from CentOS to Red Hat because they're too different. And I'm like, do you guys even know the Linux operating system? Because they're running the same kernel, and I'm like, dude, they run interchangeably. And I think that's something that with Linux, like a lot of people don't understand. It's like what you just said. There's like 3 flavors. If I'm running a Red Hat kernel, I can pick any Red Hat distro most of the time and make it work. right? So if you did hear that Red Hat killed CentOS, which they did, well, we knew it plenty ahead of time. Most of us are moving to Rocky, right? Some of us moved to Alma. I don't recommend that because that's a community-driven thing again. Hey, I'd rather stand behind the company. But I think that's something we've all have to keep an eye out for, especially when it comes to the Linux environment. But it's the freedom that it gives you guys. You're not tied with Microsoft anymore. If Microsoft decides to double their rate tomorrow, you're paying it. Or you're pirating their software, which then you're still going to have Microsoft knocking on your door, right? So Linux definitely gives you options, and I think that's something I like about it.
The one thing I want to point out too that you just mentioned is how similar like ego, going from CentOS to Rocky is. Like that's one thing that catches a lot of people off guard is like changing an operating system in Linux is nowhere near as big of a deal as it is in like Windows or Mac, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's almost identical. Like you literally just copy paste a lot of your config files over and it's just happy. Like it's fine. The only downside is if there were like major library changes and a version upgrade or something like that, right? But if you're just converting from like the latest CentOS to the current Rocky, like that shift is not that big of a deal. The one thing though that catches me in that regard is if you let your OS fall too far behind on updates and the repo drops you, that drives me insane. I have done that a few times and it is very obnoxious. But going back to like, comparing to like Windows or Mac OS or something like that, right? The thing that those ones have going for them is like marketability. Like their brand is already out there and they're well known, right? But if you look at like statistics for like Mac OS, for example, they're pretty much only a United States like operating system. They're really not adopted widely across the planet. Like, and it's because Apple's not really popular outside of the US very much. It's too expensive realistically. Whereas like Microsoft is still just the biggest, probably because they were the first to really like become well known, especially in business. So it's what people know and it's what's comfortable for them. But Linux is definitely picking up, and I have heard, especially internationally, and I need to find this statistic again because I was reading this earlier today, but I can't remember where I found it. Most of the Linux adoption lately is coming from India, which makes a lot of sense. Their population is huge. That's a lot of people, and as long as like any education on it goes forward at all, and India is very good at their computer science education, people are just going to start adopting Linux because it's free and it's there. Like there's no brand loyalty here.
Yeah, I kind of want to make fun of the new PlayStation handheld, the new PSP, and stuff that's coming out. They've already talked about it, and it's all going to run Linux. By the way, they're not running Windows. They're not running things like the Xbox is running, right? So because they are the competitor to Microsoft, why would they run their operating system, right? And even the original PlayStations, they were actually a really dummy down version of BSD. So it's just crazy to know that these operating systems have been out there forever. And way back in the day, yes, they were really just that back end server that took someone with a master's degree to understand, right? And it really isn't anymore. I mean, hell, my kids can do it just fine. It's not something that the learning curve is so much easier now. You just got to take that dive.
All right, I got a fun question for you guys. What operating systems do you use every day for yourself?
Raspberry Pi OS. Just kidding. Which actually is true. I'm really versed in that. But it's really just a Debian version, by the way. The biggest thing that I've been using just a lot of just plain Ubuntu is one of my favorites. And I've been living a lot in Parrot, but that's because it's cybersecurity. But again, it's another Debian system. I used to be a 100% Red Hat guy, like Fedora. But I've been slowly transitioning away.
I do want to clarify too. I mean all OSs. I'm not just on Linux. I just want to show like how varied we can be sometimes, right?
Windows, Android, yeah.
Yep.
I've got 11 on this PC, Windows 11, if you want to know. Mm-hmm. The one that I'm talking on right now is Windows 11.
Yeah.
You can kind of see it back here. You can see my start bar, so. Yeah.
I would say I use definitely Windows probably the most frequently, but it's not for any reason other than just like it's easy and I'm not doing anything complicated.
Office tools.
Yeah.
It's pretty much my biggest reason.
I use that for like my gaming PC. I use Chrome OS for my work laptop that I mean, on my side work laptop, I have everything in the cloud, so no reason not to just use a cloud-based OS.
Mm-hmm.
I use iOS for mobile stuff. I think Apple kills it on the mobile stuff, honestly. Uh, what else?
Yuck.
And then I've got a few different like Linux things floating around for a project here and there, but kind of I think what I'm getting at is like I don't have any loyalty to any one of these. I just kind of pick and choose based on like what makes the most sense for each use case, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I was doing network engineering off of a Mac for a long time. Not that I enjoyed it, but it was totally fine. At least it had SSH built into it, which Windows did not for a long time.
No, you didn't have to live out of putty, right? No.
Right. I'm still so used to Putty that I still just install it on everything, even though I know I don't need it.
Right. No, I think that's a very good point. And to be honest, as much as I make fun of Apple, iOS products, especially for the iPhone, top notch for privacy. I mean, everyone's heard the story about FBI trying to get Apple to unlock a phone, and they're like, "Yeah, go away." I'm sorry to say, but they do look at consumer privacy as the best in the US, right? EU shoots that down. EU has even better privacy than what we do, but at least for in the US, I think Apple is really good about that. They're not like Google, where they're going to sell all your stuff.
They just keep the data for themselves.
What do you use, Josh?
I'm mainly Windows and an Android phone. It's really my big two. I don't really jump around too much, but yeah, for work I have some, like I said earlier, Rocky Linux. I have some old CentOS boxes, Windows Server, but we're honestly trying to go as much SaaS as possible, as long as it doesn't cost us an arm and a leg, because there are some of those platforms that are.
I
will
worry
say-
about SaaS a little bit, but yeah, keep going.
Yeah.
I will say my biggest learning curve was FreeBSD. Like learning that the way that it handles partitions is so different. They're slices and they're not like permanent. They can be adjusted live. It took me a while to kind of get the hang of that. It was a little different than what I was used to. But good Lord, did that make like managing a server where I was trying to really optimize that resource utilization? Like that was so much like easier once I learned it. But again, it just comes down to like learning curves. Like we started with Windows when we were children. If we started with Linux, how different would that be?
And I think that's the big thing, though, is like if you want to jump into it, I think now is the best time. Like it's the best it's ever been. If I had to throw out an OS that I would recommend, I would recommend Zorin for my grandma, for sure. Zorin OS. I would probably recommend like a Fedora for like my mom, for somebody who's a little tech savvy but doesn't really want to learn something completely new. And then if you really want to geek out on this a little bit, I would then just say, hey, pick one of the big five, one of the big ones like Ubuntu. Like go full on Ubuntu, pick a flavor there, and just learn Debian from the inside out.
Is Kali still like the top tier pen testing OS, or is there a new one out?
No, Parrot is.
Parrot is better.
So Backtrack was before Kali.
Oh yeah, wow.
Helix was before Backtrack. So that's the big thing, is we like to name our things, but it's nothing different. You used Windows XP, you use Windows 7, Windows 8, 8.1. These are numbers. We just like to give them names, right? To be honest, the Ubuntu that I like to use right now is Cotton Candy. So, it's up to you on what you want to actually use. But right now, if you wanted to get into cybersecurity right now, and you needed to become an expert at a Linux distro, I highly recommend Parrot. Parrot is an offensive security. It has all the tools preloaded. Kali didn't have everything preloaded. It was kind of like, they're kind of here, but you still have to install them and then set them up. Parrot has them set up. It has the newest UI. It's just so much cleaner, And so I can RDP into a Parrot box, just like a Windows box. Stuff like that just makes my life that much easier.
What's it using for the RDP? Is that XRDP?
It's XRDP, yes. Which that's what a lot of Windows or a lot of Linux distributions right now are using, is XRDP. And that's just something about Linux is one of those things that's like, but I want it to have X, Y, and Z. Okay, install it. The big thing about it is there's so many repositories out there. And what a repository in a Linux environment is instead of me going to a website, let's say I wanted to download the latest version of Chrome, I could go to chrome.com, right? Or google.com/Chrome and download the newest browser. And that's what I would do on a Windows box. But on a Linux box, I would just open up a terminal window and say, apt install Chrome, and hit enter. And guess what? It's going to find where it is on the internet, download it, and install it for me, and it's ready to go. So I didn't even have to open up a web browser. And Linux has even made this even easier. Now there's software centers in all the operating systems, which is a lot like Microsoft Store if you've used it. Basically, as long as you have the repo, which is it's basically just a catalog of software that's available to download, then the update center will just like, hey, what do you want to install? You can search in the window and just download it. You can install Microsoft SQL now. You can install Microsoft Office in Linux natively. They've actually released it. And if you don't want to use any of that, there's plenty of free open source software like LibreOffice, or for me, I just use Google because Google Docs works just fine, right? There's just so many different options out there now. Yeah, I can go down a rabbit hole on installing software if you want me to. You know.
Windows Store is trash, though.
It really is. It really is.
So I'm curious, John, because you're obviously more into Linux even than myself and Kenny, but I not recently, but probably a couple months ago, discovered Snap installations.
Oh my God, I love Snap.
Yeah, it's a lot nicer than I thought, but have you had any issues using Snap? Like, I think the one issue I ran into was like giving it access to storage and giving it access to other things prior or before running software.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, Snap is a way that you can cross different platforms with compatibility in software. And what that means is, let's say I want to install an application. Here's a purpose, a full story. I wanted to install Spotify because I use Spotify for my music listening. Okay. Well, Spotify does not come out with a Linux version. They only supply a Windows version for that software. What Snap does is it takes all the Windows binaries and everything that's needed to run that software, bundle it up into what we call containers. That's basically what it is. It's just a container. And it runs a kind of like a small, tiny virtual machine in the background to run Spotify on your Linux machine. And so Snap is really cool to kind of like bridge the gap for those really weird ones. But to be honest, ever since Wine 9 came out, which is only like a month ago, I can run Spotify now natively. I don't need to use Snap. Snap was just kind of like a Band-Aid for those applications that, hey, I don't know how to install this on Windows and I don't care and I don't want to have to set up any configuration files. It's like, hey, you want a Joomla site? Here, install the Snap and you got yourself a web server. Good job. Have fun. And it took you 3 clicks. But it's only gotten better because now there's a new product called Turnkey. I don't know if anyone's heard of Turnkey. Turnkey it came out with Proxmox. Proxmox is the VMware alternative. It's a Linux-based virtual machine software, kind of like VMware, right? Well, Turnkey came out, and now you can just install mini containers with Turnkey on any box, pretty much, and even have Inception if you felt like it. Like, hey, I want to go play with Ubuntu 22. Turnkey's like, okay, here you go. And then it has a WYSIWYG at the beginning, like, hey, what user do you want on this? What password do you want on this? If you've ever done a sysprep on a Windows box where you've booted up for the first time, it's like, hey, I know I'm installed. I have everything I need, but you need to do some configuration on me. Give me a computer name. Give me a user. Give me a password. Give me an IP address maybe for my network, or do you want me to connect to one automatically? It can do all of that. So Snap is cool for those who just want to like get into it, but it's not the be-all product. It's not going to be the thing that's going to work every time. Because it is using Wine. It's basically bastardizing Windows.
It's an interesting point, though, to point out that it's using containers, right? Because a lot of people are saying that like containerization is the direct competitor or even just the evolution from virtual machines, right? I'm not sure that that's 100% true, but it's definitely not 100% false. So it's interesting to kind of see things move that direction, and then the way that you're describing it more as an emulator, that's a good way to kind of like almost prevent the need for a virtual machine for small tasks, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to the screw Broadcom, start doing
Broadcom.
containers. Go Kubernetes.
Proxmox going to do containers natively, by the way. You don't need to pay up expensive Tanzu fees if you really want to know. again, my soapbox is always going to be Linux. And I'm not saying you can't do it in Windows. I'm just saying, hey, look past that horizon, open your eyes a little bit, and know that there's more than one option. And if you ever thought that Linux was too scary to get into, trust me, it's not that way anymore. I think that's the biggest takeaway from this.
I will add, though, to Josh's point, sometimes it's just easier in Windows. Like, I'll never do a Linux print server. Cups is miserable. I'm sure there are other ways, but if you're in an Active Directory environment, just have a Windows print server. Or just don't print. That'd be nicer, too.
Or cloud print.
Or cloud print.
I'm sorry, the new Cups release is so much better.
Yeah, and hopefully your professors are a lot nicer than ours for Linux. It's like, oh, you don't know the commands? Fail.
I remember, so here's story time, because I think a few of us were in the same exact class, and I'm going to date us because this was like 2006. When this happened, it was Dr. H, to not be known, to not be named at CSU Pueblo, HUFF, and it came time for our first quiz.
Oh my God.
He didn't teach us anything. None of us have touched Linux in our lifetime. We are like PlayStation addicts, and we don't know anything about an operating system yet. He comes around and hands us all 3.5-inch floppies. And for anyone who doesn't know, floppies did exist still back then, okay?
Wish I had one.
And we were all staring at each other like, what the fuck do we do with this? He's like, why aren't any of you taking your test? And we're like, where's our test? He goes, it's on the floppy. And we're like, so we all put it in the drive. You can hear it click. And we're like, okay, how do we access the floppy? He got so pissed, man. You should have seen him. Oh. And then he finally shows us how to mount the drive. And so then we're like, how do we open the file on the floppy? Long story short, it just wasn't very good. You can't assume that somebody's going to know this kind of stuff. And the thing is Linux nowadays, if I put that floppy in that same drive, if they still exist, it would have auto-mounted it just like Windows, and I wouldn't have had to do anything.
Yep.
So that's how far Linux have come from when we learned it versus how it is today. Today, it's almost like it's better than... It's not Windows XP, where he like plugged in the USB port and it blue screened. It actually does function. So... I highly recommend.
And that's why I think a lot of people are scared of Linux, because they'll have professors like that. It's like, what do you mean you don't know what you're doing? It's like, give me Windows.
Meanwhile, I think Josh was in the back row, and I think he took his floppy and put it in his Windows side because he was like, well, I'm just going to open the file over here.
I did. It worked.
It's that weird form of elitism. Like once you use Linux enough, then you just like forget that people don't know it. But
yeah, sorry.
Hello, John.
You don't know how to use VI? What the hell's the problem? Can't use a text editor? Come on. This is easy. All you got to do is Control X, W, Y, X, D, enter. It's not that hard. No, I'm making fun. I'm just making fun.
I learned to install Nano in that class.
By the way, Nano comes... Most operating systems, Nano comes natively now, and to be honest, it just comes with gedit in most places for like the GNU editors, which is just Notepad.
Yeah.
So,
by the way, when I took Linux, I was not in that class. I got a new professor who was asked to teach the class like right before the semester started. Her name was Dr. Long, and she is a saint. And a lot of people like were grumpy about her teaching that class because she was kind of fumbling through it at the beginning. But she nominated me for a scholarship, and she's an angel.
She gave you free money.
I was a complete dick in that class until that point, and I will never say a bad thing about her ever in my life.
Right. She had a thick accent, but she was actually such a nice lady. So
yeah, I think she's still there, still teaching, still fantastic. But not her fault that she was asked to teach a class before the semester started.
Hey,
Now that I know how that works on the back end.
I'm like, as a professor, this happens all the time. Hey, this class starts on Monday. Today's Wednesday. Can you teach it? You're going to tell me what the class is? Maybe?
Yep. I've definitely.
Sure, why not?
That's just the industry now. It's not their fault.
No, it's not.
There's administration issues, or sometimes people bail and all that stuff.
Right.
It's just people. Anyway.
Well, this has been fun, guys. I mean, I really enjoyed talking about Linux. Thank you, Josh, for bringing up the topic, because you know me. I wanted to talk about Linux for a very long time. And one of the things I just want to leave everyone with is, don't be scared of it. If you want to install it. You don't have to wipe out your only computer. You can install something like Oracle Box or any of the free VM softwares and install it separately. And you can just go play with it. You don't need anything too special. And the other thing is like Google Cloud, a lot of the Linux operating systems are actually free to run. They don't charge you one penny for it. If you just want to go play and get used to it, I highly recommend.
And on that note too, a lot of people are afraid of Linux because people say they won't support it. It's not supported because people are afraid. So it's this catch-22 cycle. My advice to all of you: have confidence in your own ability to solve a problem you've never seen before. Just keep trying. You'll get there eventually. Trust me, people have Googled it. They have put it on forum posts. There's always support. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. You will figure it out, and you will get better at figuring it out. Just keep trying. Don't let somebody saying, I'm not going to help you or I'm not going to support that, scare you away. Just keep trying. You get there.
And if you're still scared, just subscribe. Thanks for joining us tonight. Or today, whatever time you watch this, whatever. Have a good day, guys.
Love you guys. Bye.